Yes, so this will be a very sort of like basic introduction to Photoshop.
Yeah.
Luckily, David Schumann has offered to do more sessions as long as we're all still isolated, possibly. It'll depend a little bit on a couple of factors. And so we may get the chance to do another more advanced version of Photoshop. This will be the sort of basic introductory level one. So we're very excited. I'm gonna post the link to the download in the description of the YouTube video. So anybody who's joining us on YouTube, if you want to download the sample data, it'll be in the description. There we go. All set. Okie dokie. And for those, we've had a couple of folks join us just in the past few seconds. So welcome everybody to I think we're on like session 6 now or something like that of the Insider's Guide to the Galaxy. And today we have a special guest. We have David Schumann with us, who knows his stuff about astrophotography, astro imaging and processing with Photoshop. And so that's what we're planning on doing today. For those just joining, I sent out a link in the chat. If you haven't seen it yet, I'll send it out again. That is the link to download the data that we're using today in Photoshop. So you can follow along with the tutorial live. It is on the large side. It's 140 megabytes. So start downloading now so we can get that going.
Actually, and that's a small picture, to be honest.
Well, it feels big to me.
It's all the data.
I guess because you have lots and lots of layers of smaller photos. Eh?
Actually, no, that's just one image. Whoa. Which I'll explain why it's so big, though, when we go through the tutorial.
Okay. Michael Watson asks, the data is just one photo, right?
Yes, it's only one TIFF image.
Okay, perfect. Wow.
Yeah, and you won't be able to see it with a lot of windows. They don't display TIFF automatically sometimes. So once you open up Photoshop, you'll see the image. If you don't have Photoshop, you can always use that image when you download a trial of Photoshop, because as you all know, Photoshop is not a freeware. But a lot of these techniques that I'm going to show you could be used in GIMP, which is free open source version of Photoshop.
Sure. Yeah, sounds good. So if you don't have a trial version, no big deal. You can just sit back and watch and learn, and then we can try the trial version. You can either download the trial version or you can apply these to GIMP. I'll send out a link about GIMP. GIMP is open source and free. I will send a link to that. Just be aware when you're using it that I believe it is open source, right, David?
It is, but it's quite different workflow than Photoshop.
Okay.
And I'm not, I've used Photoshop all my professional life, so I don't know GIMP too well.
Okay. So we'll stick with Photoshop for now. I'm going to wrap up the poll that I sent out. So if you haven't had a chance to vote, you've got 5 seconds left to do it. 4, 3, 2, 1. There's several people voting and I feel bad closing it. Okay, closing it. This was just to see how much experience folks have. We have a good mix of experience in terms of actual experience with Photoshop before. Lots of folks doing it for the first time. David, can you see the results there?
Yes, I do. Yes.
Okay, perfect. So we've got a few folks who are quite new, and then about 16 people who have said that they have used it for astrophotography before. So for you 16 people, we may not cover the amount of detail that you're looking for, but we're planning on hosting another session on this. For the rest of you, this will be the basic introductory level. And shall we get started, David?
Yes. So I'm Dave Schumann. I'm from the Montreal chapter of the Royal Astronomy Society of Canada. I've been a member almost 30 years and executive member for almost that long as well, including past president, vice president, and co-editor of our magazine. I've done some travels. I've been to Mauna Kea and Nakek, and I've photographed the space shuttle with credentials. And I'm an all-around space nut, and I love everything to do with space, rockets, and imaging, and just everything in between, and just sharing what we see in the night sky with as many people as possible. That was the original reason I started doing astrophotography. Yes, with film. That's like that old stuff that used to take images with in the 90s and early 2000s. And then digital came along. So with that, we have software to process these images. And before I start, I want to say that there's been quite a few advances in the past 10, 15 years, especially in the freeware, or what I call the open source community-driven software, such as Deep Sky Stacker, which is completely free and extremely powerful. Although Photoshop can stack images, Deep Sky Stacker is designed expressly for stacking deep sky images with stars, and you can make a star mask and other kinds of things that are more difficult to do in Photoshop without plugins. The other thing I'd like to say is there are a million ways to do the same thing in Photoshop. So I'm showing you something that someone else did some other way. That's fine. There's no right or wrong way to do things in Photoshop or with these softwares. In the end, as long as you're happy with the results that you get and what you see, that's what counts. So maybe my stars are a little bloated. Maybe mine have those diffraction spikes that are coming out of them. Some people may not like that. I do. My particular refractor has this kind of look. It doesn't matter. As long as you're happy and you're proud of what you do, you can process anything. If you want to turn it black and white, that's fine too. So with that said, I'm just going to talk just very briefly, and this continues with what was said on Tuesday with Paul, is that when you're taking deep sky images through a telescope or through a telephoto lens, here I'm primarily going to talk about, let's say, about the 350 millimeter range. I did use my William Optics GT 71 millimeter refractor. It's a triplet, and I have a field flattener. And for people that don't know, the field flattener is what allows you to have pinpoint stars from the edge to edge of the photo without those stars looking bloated or stretched. So those are the equipment that I use with the Ioptron SkyGuider Pro, which is very compact, and I am pushing it to the limits with that telescope. But what's important to know is that I'm using, in my case, the mirrorless Sony Alpha 6300 camera. A DLSR, or digital single lens reflex camera, is simply the same kind of camera, except mine doesn't have that mirror in it because we're not using film anymore. It's digital. So through the viewfinder, I see a live image of what the camera's looking at. So I use that for focus with a Batinov mask, which is a mask with 3 gradiated lines that are put in front of the lens cap, let's say, of either your telephoto lens or your telescope. And when the cross lines converge as you're focusing in and out, you know you're perfectly on focus. So that's something I highly recommend. And either Paul could talk about that in the future, or I could explain that in another session. But
sorry, David, I don't want to interrupt. Could you tell me what that was called again, just so I can make a note of it?
It's called a Batinov mask. It's essentially something that goes right in front of the lens cap. It replaces the lens cap, and it has essentially, in a triangular pattern, slits that are cut. And when you actually take an image through this mask, the stars will have diffraction spikes. And if you're out of focus, the spikes will not line up. They'll be like a crisscross, but they'll be offset. And then when they're totally converged, you know you're dead on focus. And ever since I started using the Batinov mask, I've never gone back for focusing. It's just incredible. I love it.
I'm going to just share my screen quickly. Is it this that you're talking about?
Yes, it is. Yes.
Cool. Okay.
Yes.
So that's when these three lines converge to show that it's focused.
Yeah, there's like a crisscross pattern, and when all three let's say converge into each other like an asterisk shape, and they're dead on, perfectly aligned, you know that you're focused. It's really cool. It's a lifesaver. I could tell you that.
That's very cool.
So I did use that for my photos, and of course I took the one I'm going to use as a demo is the Great Orion Nebula M42. It has quite a range of like dynamic range to look at, because there's soft nebula and features in the heart of the Orion Nebula, but there's also bright parts of the gaseous areas as well, different colors, reflection and emission nebula. So not to get too crazy with this, but it's a good example. And I'll show a few other examples that I've photographed in recent times. where Photoshop can enhance these things. But before we start all this, why we're talking about Deep Sky Stacker is really comes down to signal versus noise. And not to scare anybody about this, but like everything, and like in the past, when we used to use old-fashioned 35mm film, the grain of the film, when the film was more sensitive, the grain was larger, it was more visible, it was noisier. Today, we don't have film, but we do have the sensors in these cameras. And each sensor is essentially a pixel that has red, green, green, and blue. And I'll explain in a second why I said red, green, green, blue. But just think of this as a matrix of pixels. And each of these 4 pixels in your camera, arranged in a checkerboard pattern, create your image, your color image. And when Photoshop decodes the image with the raw system, it turns that pattern of red, green, green, blue into a full color image. That's called the Bayer pattern. We might have mentioned it on Tuesday. And this is automatically done by Photoshop and Deep Sky Stacker, so you don't have to worry about it. But what we want to do is take the maximum amount of data from those pixels and use them for our image. But of course, nothing's perfect and no sensor's absolutely free of noise. So why we use Deep Sky Stacker is that we try to eliminate the noise. And this noise is random, by the way. So as you take, let's say, if you were to take just one image, and I'll open up one in a minute to show you, you take just one frame of, let's say, 20 seconds, for example. You'll get the image of Orion. It'll show up in color, but it's going to be very grainy, very noisy. Now, if I take 100 images in the same session, or even on different nights, let's say it gets cloudy, I have to pack up, I go back the night later, and Orion is still there, of course. I position the camera roughly in the same orientation, and I keep the same, I don't zoom in or out, I keep the same focal length, let's say with my telescope. I can still use that data and continue stacking on the data from the night before to reduce the noise. And as you stack, what happens is the Deep Sky Stacker not only eliminates many of the images that are either blurred or just too trailed, but it'll average out all of those images. In other words, taking the best of these images and stacking them together and save them as a TIFF file. And I'll explain that as we go. This can be a little overwhelming at first because there's a lot of formats. And when I had you guys download the TIFF format, that's 138 megs, you must be saying to yourself, that's crazy. My phone only saves pictures that are a couple of megs. And when I go on Facebook, they're not even a meg. However, they're not all equal. And they look like the same picture, but they don't carry the same amount of information. And it's all about the information in that image. So before I start Deep Sky Stacker, I just want to say that in the general computing world and our daily lives, we use 8-bit images. And not to say anything frightening about this, but that simply means that for red, green, and blue, which makes up a video image, unlike printing, which is CMYK, that's the opposite. We're dealing with video images and images from cameras. The R has 8 bits, the G has 8 bits, and the blue has 8 bits. 8 times 8 is 16, and you multiply that again, it gives you 256. So right now, 256 gradations of red, gradations of green and blue give you 16.7 million colors. So if you multiply 256 times 256 times 256, you get 16.7 million variations of color represented by the red, green, and blue grayscale channels. And with Deep Sky Stacker, although my camera is limited in the amount of bits it can take, by adding all this extra information and stacking all these images together, I have enough data to actually save out a high dynamic image of 16 bits. And as you can imagine, all of a sudden, what would have been just a couple of megabytes is squared, and now I have 138 megs. And that's why that image is so large. If it were 32 bits, it would have even been like, in a half gigabyte range. We don't need 32 bits, and a lot of the functions of Photoshop won't even work in 32 bits. That's in the billions of color range. And we can get what we need easily out of the 16-bit image saved by Deep Sky Stacker. So I'm just going to quickly open up Photoshop just to see. I'm going to share my screen.
As you do that,
yeah,
I'm just going to address one thing that one person mentioned to
sure.
us, which was that noise isn't always random, and it's like a very technical point, but he has a point in terms of like dark and bias noise, but
Yes.
that's getting really, really advanced. I just wanted to address it because he brought it up.
Yes.
Dark being like things like hot pixels on your camera.
That's right.
And bias being stuff like the noise that comes as the data moves from your camera to your memory device.
That's right. I mean, there's sometimes also the camera trails because, you know, the tracking's not perfect, or in many cases you do want to move the camera just slightly so that you're getting different noise patterns that can be more easily canceled out later.
Yes.
But I would save that for a second talk.
Yeah,
and we
100%.
can really go
Yeah.
deep into that. That's a whole talk by itself.
And
yeah. So I'm going to share my screen, and I just want to make sure that I'm sharing it properly. It says share screen interface.
So it's the green button on the bottom?
No, I don't see that on the Zoom. Let me max it out. Okay, share screen. Okay, I'm maxing it out. And I'm going to choose the screen. I'll look at the questions and answers after because that box popped up for me too.
Oh yeah, that's not it. That's okay. That was more of my own curiosity.
Yeah, no problem. So
perfect.
I don't know if you can see my empty background here.
We can, yeah.
Okay, you see Photoshop now?
Yeah.
Okay, so before we go into anything, I'm just opening it to show you one of the noise I was talking about, for example. So in my M42, I'm just going to pull out one random image. Now this is RAW, so I'm just going to open it. It's using my Sony RAW. Canon and other models call their RAW. You know, mine's called ARW. Different cameras like CR2 for Canon. But essentially the raw image, and for those that don't know, the camera essentially reads what the chip is emitting and saves it in an undestructive format. When you save as a JPEG only, it would be very difficult, next to impossible, to do stacking or processing of images because a JPEG is what's called a lossy format. And the RAW is a lossless format. In other words, it retains all the information, and unless you strike over that image or erase it, you can always go back to it to reset the image essentially and play around with it. So you're getting the maximum amount of value out of that image. A JPEG is like essentially a snapshot of that's saved, and it's saved in a format that's compressed, where a lot of the color and even resolution information is stripped to make it a smaller file, let's say for Facebook or for sharing with friends. But you can never go back into that JPEG and get back the detail that was lost. So it's like, if you remember photocopying a photocopy of a photocopy, a JPEG is like that. When we use TIFF format, tag image file format, the TIFF format is a lossless. It can be compressed, but you would always save it uncompressed. And that's why when you export the image from Deep Sky Stacker, which I'll show you in a minute, it's saved as a TIFF image for the best quality. So this is a raw image that I'm showing you on my screen here. And you could start to see the noise and the grain from that image.
So just a heads up, for some reason, David, we actually can't see, I can't see the image anyway. It's just like a black screen. We saw it briefly for a second and now it's a black screen.
Oh, I might be sharing the wrong screen. Just 1 second here.
Okay. We're on the screen that has the, oh, there we go. This one looks better.
Okay, so it was on the wrong screen. Let me move it to my primary screen. I'm sorry. I just got to get to it because everything is hidden. You see Photoshop now?
No, so we're on the screen that has, oh, there, yep.
Okay, so now you should be seeing the screen that I'm seeing for Photoshop. And what I did, sorry about that, I just simply opened my raw image, one of the raw images, the 22nd image, and you can see how the sky is milky here. You guys can see that? It's not purely black. And that is from the light pollution essentially. And when I zoom in to, if you can see the noise and the grain in the image,
Yeah.
this is what I'm talking about. By using Deep Sky Stacker, we'll be able to soften that or eliminate as much as possible the noise by stacking dozens of images. Now, for time's sake and for the tutorial's sake, here I'm going to just minimize Photoshop. I only stacked several images to show you the process, because if not, it would take, probably an hour. So I'm going to open up Deep Sky Stacker, which is a freeware that you could download and play with. And as well, this, if you guys can all see the Deep Sky Stacker interface, I'm not going to go deep into it because it can get really crazy, but we're just going to essentially stack our images. Now, I don't have certain bias files. I didn't take all that at the time when I took my Orion photo. I just took some basics. So here on the left-hand side at the top is where you import your set of images. So open picture files, and that's what we would call the subs or the actual light frames. And in my case, I have them here. They're in the raw format. They have to be for the maximum value. I'm going to open them, and they're loaded down at the bottom here. And then I'm going to say check all, so that when the processing happens, the stacking, it's going to use all those images. If there were certain images that you didn't care for example, you can go through them and you can uncheck it and it'll just ignore that. That's one thing. But in this case, I want to use all of them. Okay, I'm going to also open up my flat files. Okay.
While you open those, I'll briefly mention what flats are, because they're essentially essentially just frames that tell you where light has focused more on one part of an image than another, if that's right. Because some telescopes and some cameras will have automatic sort of or incidental vignetting. So when the outside parts of it are dark and the middle is brighter, because more light gets focused on the middle part than it does on the outer parts.
That's right.
And so this takes care of that particular bias, or
yes.
that issue.
And in my case, since I'm using a mirrorless DSLR camera, I'm interchanging the lens very often, and it exposes the sensor to the outside world. And sometimes dust, actually many times, dust gets in, especially when you're out in the countryside and there's dirt. And so that flat field would also help to eliminate dust bunnies and other artifacts from your image. Okay. And I'm loading in the dark files here. So this is done with the lens cap off, obviously, immediately after or even before my session. So with all of this loaded in, you'll see down here at the stack, you'll see that it's represented by Deep Sky Stacker. You have your lights, you have your dark, and then I have my actual subs or light frames, the actual photo, if you could say, the normal photo. And it's not hard. It's simply stack check, registered check pictures. And here I'm taking 80% of them, but you can play around with that. And I'm essentially using it on autopilot. I'm just having it register. So right now it's going through and it's looking at all the stars in my field for every photo, and it's mathematically adjusting it so that each photo is offset or tilted so that they're all going to be ready to be stacked on top of each other as perfectly aligned as possible. You can do this in Photoshop. You can even do it by hand, one frame at a time, but that's very tedious. So this is really a nice software, especially that it's made with care from for the astronomy community at large. They're not charging anything for this except maybe a donation. So right now it's also automatically stacking those images. And it knows which ones were flat and which ones were dark and subs, and it's appropriately stacking the whole thing automatically. Go ahead.
So there's a question saying, this is an interesting one. The flat file is correct for lens issues and dust spots. Curious why you need more than one. Seems like they would, you had more than one of them, right?
Yeah, they say and different people say different things, to take 3 or 4 or 5 of these things. It's also because of the noise pattern as well. Like the more data you have, the better. But
Mhm.
already, I don't know about you guys, but if you looked at one of my images, one of my original images, it looked nothing like this. So already this is bringing out a lot of detail that just wasn't there before. I like to saturate this a little. Now you might look at this and say, oh my God, that's terrible. It's all black and white. Deep Sky Stacker, everybody says originally when you look at the image, it does look lifeless. And that's where the Photoshop comes in. Although Deep Sky Stacker has processing, basic processing. For example, before I send it out as a TIFF image, I'd like to increase the saturation just a little, just to give it a little more life. And then you have to say apply. Every time you do a change, you have to reapply it. And then it recalculates it for you. Okay. Now you can save your your Deep Sky Stacker session so that you can open it up again and play around with the image again. But right now, because I want to get into Photoshop, I'm just going to go ahead and actually save this image itself before we go into Photoshop. I'll save it as a TIFF image. So processing, open picture, save picture to file.
So just as you're doing that, I'm going to answer a question. So you keep going doing what you're doing. A question from Monique Martel, which I was about to type out, but I'll just say aloud. And several people have already answered. How do you make or take a flat? Dan has said that you can take sky flats or you can use a light box. Peter has said that some people cover the front of the telescope with a white t-shirt and then provide a light box for a light source. And I wanted to add in that when we're doing them we have this telescope that we use for, that we have we're working on a project that's going to be launched shortly with this telescope, the Rask robotic telescope. And the way that we do flats when we're talking about sky flats is we wait for dawn when there's more light in the sky, and we let that light flood the CCD essentially, so the chip that records the information. And one of the reasons that we have to take multiple flats is because sometimes there are still stars in that photo, and if you take multiple ones, then the stars get canceled out by stacking them.
The thing to say also is that, if I'm not mistaken, you have to set your camera to auto exposure so that when it looks like at that bright light source, obviously if you take a 20-second shot of a t-shirt with the bright light from a cell phone shining behind it, it's going to blow out and turn out pure white. So you don't want that. You want the camera to actually take that exposure where it's sort of in between, a light background, but showing where the defects are. So you could still record the dust and everything and the vignetting. So here I'm just saving it to where I can find it again in my folder. And you'll see here, I just titled it what I wanted to. And it's asking you about different formats, 32-bit, 16-bit. I just leave it to 16-bit per channel of information. No compression. That's very, very important that you no compression. So we're just saving that image, and that's it. You can actually save your project file. In this case, I'm just going to close it because I already have quite a few files. And now I'm going to go back into Photoshop. I'm going to start Photoshop, and we'll be able to play around with some things. So we're in Photoshop, and the basic thing is that you want to make sure that, Photoshop has quite a few things, okay? But the most important things for Photoshop is that you have layers, because we're working with layers, and I'll explain that. And you want to have some of the panels on the side here. It's just to make it easier to access. But once you have layers, it's easy to get to the adjustments, which I'll be showing in a few minutes. But it's all about the layers. And another thing to see is channels, layers and channels. So first, I'm going to close my panels because there could be quite a few panels. I'm going to open up that image. So File, Open. It's very simple. And I'm going to look for that TIFF image. So right here, only TIFF. I believe it's this one here, demo. So can everybody see the screen? You see the image that was stacked?
We can indeed.
Okay. And there's shortcuts in Photoshop. So I'm used to all these shortcuts. But for people that are not into the shortcuts, so you go to Windows up here and Layers, also F7. And Layers is what I call home base for me. I can't do Photoshop without layers. Now, what are layers? Layers are one of the most powerful parts of Photoshop, and that's the way that we can do a lot of things undestructively. And what I mean by that is, we're going to be working with this image, and we're going to save this project as a PSD file or Photoshop document file. And that's not your final image. That's your working file where you can make constant adjustments. You can bring in other images and play around with it. You can go back to it even years later, open it up, and continue to play around with it. You can save as from the PSD file or the layered image. That's where you save out your JPEG or a TIFF, good quality TIFF. So you want to print it, for example, or share it with friends. That's where you would do that. But essentially, the file itself, and keep in mind that Photoshop files can start to be very large. So whereas that TIFF image was only 130, as a matter of fact, I'm going to open the one I sent you guys, not the one from just a few minutes ago. So this is the one I sent. When you're opening this, it is 130 megs, and like I said before, it's because that each red, green, and blue channel has 16 bits of grayscale information. Okay, so instead of 256 variations of gray to play with, you have 1024 shades of gray. So this gives you much more control, although your computer monitor most likely can't display that because most monitors are only 8 bits. So when you see the layers, and I also have my channels panel and my history, the history is what allows you to undo or to go back in time to a certain step that you're doing. So you can think of it as multiple undos when you think about it. Depends on the settings of your memory. You can have like 100 of these things easily. It's pretty amazing. The earlier versions of Photoshop years past, you couldn't really undo stuff. So it was kind of not easy. So I'll go back to layers. You'll see that the Photoshop layers says background and there's a lock. When your initial image comes in, it always comes in and it's named as a background. That you keep, you don't really touch. You don't play around with it. But what I'd like to do is make a copy of this background image. And you can do that with Control J or Command J. Or if you don't remember, you can simply take the image, drag it to the plus symbol at the bottom, and that creates a new layer. So think of layers as panes of glass stacked on top of each other. And the bottom of the glass, let's say on the table, is where your master image is. And every time you stack a new sheet of glass on top, for example, I'm stacking another sheet, another sheet, another sheet. On each of these stacks of glass, let's say, I can do things. I can paint something. And I'm just doing this as a demo to show you what's happening. You see the way the cyan one that I just drew is underneath the yellow one. You can actually take these layers and interchange them. And I'm doing this demo to show you how the layers behave. But what's really important is we can, and the eyeball just simply turns off the layers. See right now, that checkerboard pattern means that there's nothing there. It's not visible. When I turn it back on, my original background layer is on. I'm just going to work with that copy for now. I always leave the background just as a safety net so I can always go back to it. I'm not accidentally doing anything to it.
It's always nice to have a backup plan.
Yeah. And speaking of which, and this is learned after many painful lessons in life, File, Save As, or Shift Control S, or Shift Command S, and save it as not a TIFF, but this time Photoshop PSD, Photoshop document. Okay, so here I'm going to say M42 demo, and I'm saving it to where I can find it. It's gonna pop up this box just to maximize compatibility. Say OK. So now, if something goes on, if it crashes, although Photoshop's quite a stable program, it does crash. You can always open up your work, and most of what you would have done would have been saved up until the time you save. So Control or Command S, save often, or simply File. Let's say I'm adding another layer, File, Save. OK. Including layers will increase. Always keep the layers, because if you don't, you're going to lose the work that you've done. So essentially, that's layers. And what is powerful about layers is that I can do something to that layer. I'm just going to do something very quickly. For example, I'm going to add, let's say, what is it? Brightness and contrast, something very basic. So here, this is what's called an adjustment layer. So a while back, Photoshop made it so that you can add layers. And these layers are actually adjustments to the layers underneath that stack of glass, let's say. And so whatever I do in this layer, in these controls, will affect the images underneath it all the way to the bottom of the stack, okay? So for example, if I increase the brightness of the image and decrease the contrast, you could start to see some of the details in the nebula forming. Some of the, I'm zooming in, but you can actually start to see some of the outer parts of the nebula. So this is what's called an adjustment layer. And just with that one adjustment, look what I did. I took this image, which is kind of maybe what you would start to see in a telescope, but now I'm starting to bring in more details that I want to see in the image. So that's the power of layers. And what's interesting is when you double click on the actual icon, it opens up the layer, the adjustment panel, and you can go and readjust it to your heart's content. That's what's so powerful about this. You can go back and change your mind, and it won't destructively alter the other parts of the image. And that's why Photoshop is so powerful. And what's interesting is you'll see that on the layers here, there's two components to the layers. There's the actual image itself, and this here at the bottom here is a mask. And that mask affects your layer, what you'll do with your layer. And very simply, a mask is a way to control the opacity, or what's shown and what's hidden on that particular layer. So for example, anytime the mask is shown as all white, it's going to allow anything white to pass through at 100% opacity. Anything that's dark or pure black, for example, will make the mask, make it so that it hides what's in that black area. So if I take my brush, for example, and I'm using the open and close bracket keys as a shortcut just to create the different size of the brush. And this is more advanced, so I'm just going to show you what the power of this. You see what I'm doing? I'm actually, remember that my background's closed. It's closed off. I'm actually making, where I'm painting, that part of that layer invisible to the rest of the image, okay? And what's white is showing through. And you have to make sure you're not on the actual image itself, but on the mask. And that's denoted by these little 4 checkbox highlights. You see here, I'm toggling. Now I'm working on the mask only. Now let's say, oops, I do want to show Orion. I go back here on the left side, and I don't want to jump around too much, but on the left side of your panel, there's quite a few buttons here. I'll go through them, so the basics of them. But at the bottom, you have the black and white checkers, boxes. And this is a quick way of getting pure white and pure black to be selected in Photoshop. So right now, I'm actually have pure black set up. And if you double click on it, it opens up the color dialog box, and you'll see it's pure black down here. Because masks work only in grayscale, even if I choose something, let's say the middle of the reds here, it's going to only show it as a grayscale there. Even though my image is red, green, and blue, for example. So I'm going to put it back to white, pure white, and I'm painting it back in. So I just did that quickly to show you the power of masks and the layers. If I don't want the mask anymore, I simply drag it to the trash. But before, you have to unlink it. Right now, this mask is linked to this image. So if I move around this layer, because like a piece of glass that I mentioned earlier, you can slide this panel or this layer anywhere you want, but normally it's staying put because we just want to process the whole thing. You want to decouple it by clicking on the chain to decouple it, then you can drag it into the trash. Apply, no, I don't want to apply the mask, I really want to get rid of it. So that's the basics of the layers part. Nothing more complicated or simple than that. The eyeball simply shuts it off, shuts off. This is that adjustment layer. Now, let's say we did the adjustment layer on top of the image to make it a little brighter and less contrast, so more subtle details show. But I still find this is too bright in here. That mask, for example, when I'm on the mode of the mask, when I'm on the mode of the mask, I can actually take my paintbrush, and I won't show this today, but paintbrushes can come in different shapes and sizes. The paintbrush itself is set to the maximum softness or hardness. The maximum hardness makes a very sharp edge, but you want to work always usually with the soft edges here. And you can adjust the size, or you can use a shortcut to do that. But I'm just showing you that if I want just the center part of M42 to not be as bright, I can use this mask and make sure that it's pure black or the dark. And right now, it doesn't show that much, but
is it because you're on the dodge tool instead of the paintbrush?
Yes, you're right. I don't know why that happened. I thought I was on the, thank you. I thought I was on the brush. We won't talk about dodge and burn. That's another process. But in the brush tool, you would actually, thank you. You would actually go into that mask, and right away, just by adding the little dab that I did, you could see the difference where I still have the hot spot in the core, but it's not completely blown out, but I have the outer edges of my nebula showing. So just with that alone, you start to see results that are different than what was originally there. And one other thing that it makes it easy to work with is here at the bottom, I can add in different things into my layers. And one of them, if you look at this half circle, filled in circle, I can add in a solid color, for example, and make it solid black. Color fill, put that all the way on top of your background. And now every time you open something or close something, you leave this alone and it'll go to pure black. So at least it's easy to see what you're doing. You don't get that checkerboard pattern, because the checkerboard pattern is Photoshop's way of saying, I'm ready for business, put things on top, start laying things on top. I'm ready to go. It's transparent, but we don't want that. We just want to use the solid background so that it's easy to see what we're doing with these application of layers. So that's essentially layers starting off.
I have a question from somebody in the comments about layers.
Sure. Yeah.
And does it matter as to which layers are processed first?
Yes. And I thank you for that question. I was going to get to that. It turns out that the order that things are stacked in here are the visual order from bottom to top. So you can kind of think of looking, like I mentioned earlier, think of a table and think of sheets of glass. And the table is your background. It's the bottom at the background, or essentially the color fill, because I filled it all black here. that's my table. And then I'm stacking a new sheet of glass on top of it. That's my actual image that we made a copy from the background for safety. That's my first sheet. And then I'm adding another sheet on top of it. If I continue to do these effects, it does depend on the stacking order of those sheets, or in other words, layers. And you'll see that in a minute. The adjustment layer, as I mentioned earlier, affects everything immediately below all the way to the bottom of the stack, or essentially that stack of glass. So let's say you want this to only affect the background copy and not, let's say, anything below it. When you go into the actual adjustment itself, not the mask, but the adjustment, double click on it to activate it. There's a little icon here on the left with a little arrow protruding down. That signifies, when you select that, that it's only anchored, and you can close the dialog here with the, you double click and you can minimize it with that double arrow. It essentially puts it away. This little arrow pointing down means that this is only affecting the immediate layer underneath it and nothing else. So most times when we're working with adjustment layers, we're working so that it's universal, that it's going through the whole stack as you build up your effects. But if you wanted one certain thing, you can make it only affect the one below it. And in this case, you wouldn't have to use a mask maybe to mask out certain things. It can get complicated to where you have dozens of these layers. And in one of my processes that I did for getting the Milky, not the Milky Way, but the M42 and the Running Man to come up the way it did, I didn't want to show this to you guys today, but I had several dozen layers in groups. So you can actually take all of these, for example, and you hold down the shift key, and you can select multiple layers, and then you can actually group them in with this folder. You turn them into a group, and that group essentially becomes all of those layers into its own component. They're still individually addressable, where you can edit them, but they're in that group. And this helps you to make, let's say I can rename the group. You double click and you can name it to contrast. Pardon my typing, I'm terrible. So now I know that this was my contrast, for example, and then you can keep building things, and then you can even create, here's the mask. I can make a mask just for that whole group. So you could see that with a few short keystrokes and the use of the layers, you could start to see that this can get pretty detailed in how you do something. You can maybe touch up just one part of the image. Let's say like the Running Man here should be a little bluer, which I'll show you a little later. This could be a little more on the magenta side. You can enhance things and then use the mask to paint selectively, paint in or expose only what you want the end image to view, to show. So if you want to make sure the Running Man has a certain contrast to it, but this is less contrast, you can do that by mixing these groups with the layers and using masks to reveal only parts of what you want to reveal. And because it's not destructive, you didn't flatten it down, for example, I can always go back and change my mind. So for example, I'm going to duplicate this entire stack with that plus command. I'm going to rename it to contrast, let's say 2. I'll go in there and I'm going to exaggerate something on purpose. For example, I'm just going to do something where I'm going to add another adjustment layer. Whoops, sorry about that. And this way, I'm going to show you, let's say, hue and saturation. This one, so I can exaggerate to show you. And hue and saturation is one of the adjustment layers where you can adjust the hue of what you're looking at. So you see, as you move the slider, the range of colors are shifting in the spectrum so that you can actually make things like greener or bluer. I mean, I can increase the saturation to exaggerate, which I'm doing on purpose. Remember, this is only affecting everything after the brightness. So if I close the brightness, you see what happened? If I swap these around, now you'll see the brightness is still there, and there's that highly exaggerated. But if I leave it the other way, I just want to show you the differences here. So I'm going to close that group, and using the mask, I'm going to show you that you could just paint what you want. And although we're nowhere near what we want to do with this image, of course, I just wanted to do an exaggerated processing so that you could see what's going on with this. And let's say, oh, that's terrible. I'm going to, here on the left side of the toolbar, the basic tool sets, there's a little toggle set of arrows where I can swap between pure white and pure red. These are the two base colors to work with. And they can be any color. When you double click, I can turn this into red. I can turn this into a green, but remember that since I'm working on the mask, it's only grayscale. So here I'm going to, here is to reset it to pure white and pure black. But just to easily invert it, I'm painting with black again in my mask, but I changed my mind. I want to fix that. So I put it back to white. So I'm revealing in the mask that whole layer. Now, the other thing that's really important about all this is that, and I'm going to get rid of this so not to get complicated. Here, another thing, I'm going to select all my items inside that folder, and I'm going to move them outside the folder. They're on their own. I'm just getting rid of that folder. So this is back to what it was before I put them in a group. The other thing you can do is to create a smart object. So just like that layer, I can right click and say convert to smart object. And what that does, it's similar to that group. It's going to keep everything in there, except it's literally creating a layer that contains all of these objects inside of themselves that you can just double click and you go into it, and I'm back to what I had. There's certain advantages with working with smart objects versus working with groups only. Smart objects never lose the scale of the items. And when you're scaling things with groups, it scales it destructively. When you're scaling items, let's say you're blowing something up or shrinking it, you get to keep the original item that's inside. So working with smart objects sometimes can be a good way to go. With a smart object denoted by this little marking here in the layer, you can apply all of those adjustments like we showed earlier. Let's say like this one, curves, which I'll show probably in the second talk, because this, to me, curves is one of the most powerful things in Photoshop to work with. It's really where the magic starts to happen. But I just want not people to get overly confused about all these things. So I just want to show you that that's the anything you do with a smart object, you could like say I can add a mask as well, the same thing. So here, remember that history here on the right is all of the things that I've done in the past little while. Starting from the most recent at the bottom, you can actually see going back in time. I just undid that smart object, for example. So I'm back to where I started with the history. So window history, for example, okay? So that's layers. And one more powerful, very powerful thing of layers, and don't be afraid of this. It's something you have to experiment with, but it's so powerful. You remember I said that you can treat layers as panes of glass, for example, and your image are, let's say, writing on those panes of glass that are stacked on top of this table. You can control what happens in between these layers or panes of glass by what happens to the blending mode. And essentially, what I'm going to show you now tells Photoshop how to take that layer that's on top, the current layer that I'm on, and how to display it based on what's underneath it. So for example, normally you would set it, you would leave it as normal. All of these are set to normal. And normal means that unless you have a mask, the opacity is at 100%. But what happens if let's say I duplicate this background copy. I make a duplicate or Control J, for example, or simply if you don't know the shortcuts off by heart, just drag that into the plus, makes a duplicate of it. You'd say, okay, that was exciting. Nothing happened. And to show you that, I'm toggling back and forth. Nothing happened. Why? Because it's normal. As a matter of fact, if I hide what's underneath it, still nothing happened. That right now, everything underneath is turned off. I can open up that blank black background, but you'll see that the image is there. However, with everything turned back on, if I change the blending mode, for example, to screen, look what happened. It literally took that same image, and it's as if you took a flashlight or a slide projector and actually projected the image back onto itself. So it's as if you took a transparency and shone light through it back onto itself on a screen. It essentially kind of doubles the light output of it. And you can start to use this to bring out some details without affecting the curvature of those details. In other words, it took the exact image and stacked it back on top of itself. Now, I can also control the opacity with a mask, but also universally, here at the top right of this layers panel, I have the opacity, and that affects how much of that layer is shown through. You know, let's say 12, 13%, all the way to 100%. And by using this slider, I can really start to control how much I'm stacking over that image. You could start to see, so it's put back to 100, you can see here. So these are the basics that I wanted to explain today without having to go into details about curves and S-curves and things that we can do to make the processing more interesting. Now, I'm starting to bring this out. I can also go in and to this stack on top of the brightness, for example, I can go and add a, let's say, a hue saturation adjustment layer. And in here, I'm actually going to enhance the saturation to make this exaggerated. Okay. Now, it's not saying that this image is false. Hey, I didn't see this with my eye in the telescope. You're kind of cheating. What is that? Why is it like deeper reds and pinks? But you're trying to show something that you normally can't see with the naked eye through an eyepiece, or because don't forget that the camera sees a lot deeper because of those long exposures. If we could have eyes that were as sensitive as the sensor in the camera, we would start to see color. As a matter of fact, when I've looked at a 36-inch reflector at Stellafane a few years ago, I started to see color in the Dumbbell Nebula, pinks and greens, because the telescope is so powerful and it's gathering so much concentrated light that with my eye in the eyepiece, I can start to see color. So imagine looking through the Hubble with the naked eye. Yes, if we could float in space and do that, you would start to actually see color because it's so powerful. But here, all I have is my camera with my 70mm refractor. So no, I need to rely on those stacked images that essentially stack an hour's worth of detail into the image to start to get those colors, the information to be there. And Deep Sky Stacker is essentially stacking your image to where it looks like this. It's kind of black and white-ish, it's boring. But what's important to understand is because it's 16 bits of information per channel, and I'll explain channels in a minute, you're going to see that the information is there. And that's why this original TIFF file was 138 megs. If I had saved it as a JPEG, it would have been just a few megs, but I would never be able to do what I just did now. It would look terrible. It would look all blown out, washed out with a lot of grain. Here, by keeping all the information in that and working in the 16-bit format per channel. And by the way, you could see that, see the little number 16 at the top?
Yeah.
So that tells me that I'm in 16 bits per channel of color information right now, or grayscale information for red, green, and blue. And this is why when I increase the saturation, for example, I am able to start to get some of these beautiful tones in here. I didn't apply any sharpening, but for example, you could start to use an adjustment let's say for the vibrance, for example, an adjustment. You could see that in this dialog box. Some of these dialog boxes, you just, you'd make them to the size that's comfortable for your screen, because you can start to get panels all over the place. And if any of you, I work in motion graphics, and if any of you have ever used After Effects, you could easily see why you need 3 screens sometimes just to use the software for editing, because every little thing has a drop-down menu with a sub-menu and sliders and even places to add commands and programming. But here, Photoshop's not as bad. Yeah.
Yeah, and it's one of those things that kind of makes Photoshop a little bit, and Adobe products a little bit intimidating, is because there are so many options, and if you click a button and some of them go away, and if you don't know how to get them back, then it's very stressful. So be patient with Photoshop.
Yeah, and this is why I wanted to give you guys a general tour of Photoshop and not to dive into how I'm going to make this image look better than it is now, because right now I obviously would not accept this image. I just was exaggerating what I'm doing to show you the effect of what's happening. So here, if I want to increase the vibrance of the image, increase the saturation, not too much. I can decrease the saturation as well. But what's nice about this is it's not destructive. Here's the undo, you're starting back from the beginning. So for example, I'll go back into vibrance. You can play around with the mask with this. Here, I minimize it, I collapse it. And these panels, there's this little part here under the panel. You can actually clip it to where you want in your panels box here. So you'd have to get used to this. And right now, I'm only using one screen because I want to show you guys what I'm doing. Normally, I'd be using 2 screens, if not 3 screens sometimes, because, like I said, I want to work only with my main image and have that whole image on my screen while I have all the controls and these panels on another screen, because it can get a little ridiculous. However, for people with laptops and for the sake of this demo, I'm trying to leave everything on this one screen. So that's why you see this overlap. Now, when you zoom in, you can zoom in, and here is the zoom icon. By holding down the left mouse key, for example, in Windows, I'm zooming it by moving the mouse left and right, up or down, excuse me. I'm actually to zoom in and out of the whole image. You can also use the shortcuts on your keyboard with the Control plus and minus to bring it in steps. And if I go Control, I believe Control O is for opening a file, but Control 0 is to bring back the image to the full screen. And you can actually, when you zoom in and you see, here's the percentage of the actual image. My image is 6,000 by 4,000 when it came out of my camera, pixels. So by coming in at 100%, right now, 1 pixel on my video screen equals 1 pixel of my image. If I go beyond that, let's say to 200%, 300, 400, you can start to see the actual individual pixels. As crazy as that is, that's how accurate Photoshop is. You can actually just go ahead and just do something with 1 pixel only and paint it in. And what I'm doing now is I'm using the space bar and my mouse to actually, the space bar toggles the hand or the grab icon, and I'm actually moving the image in my window with the hand. So if I go back to Control or Command 0, I'm back to where I started. Here's my full 6,000 by 4,000 pixel image, which is quite a large image actually coming out of that camera. And what's nice about that is later on, when I want to crop it to, let's say, an HD image, 1920 by 1080, that's standard high definition image, and I want to put that on Facebook, I can actually take this whole image and slide it in, the final image, into that crop window, and actually it'll only show this part of my image. So it's a way of cropping the image to only what I want to show and not the stars around it. And I'll do that next time when we get more familiar with this. So the power of layers, as I said, normally we're on normal, but there's all kinds of things that you can do. And what I'm going to do is scroll through this, I'm using my up and down arrow keys, and I'm scrolling down through the modes. And these are mathematical modes where you divide or you add lighter color from that, how this layer is displayed on top of the rest of the stack, let's say. So there's different things. A pin light, that's an important one because it really affects the way certain things are visible and not. Some are useless, for what we're doing. Some actually subtract the image. So this image, this layer is subtracted from the layer underneath. So if I'm taking one away from one, I get nothing, right? I'm dividing. Here's hue, saturation, color. So you can actually bring in layers that are, let's say, monochromatic, and you can affect how that affects what's underneath it based on the blend mode here. I'm going to put it back to normal, which is normally set to normal. But I just wanted to show you the power of layers and why Photoshop is so incredible. Another little interest, I'm sorry, go ahead.
I was just going to say so you've shown us a lot of the tools that are used and the organization of all this stuff, especially with the sample data that you have.
Yeah.
You can always re-download that. So don't be afraid to try stuff.
You have to experiment.
Play with it. That's the best way to learn a lot of these things because David's doing a ton of this stuff very fast. And it's not something that, you've been doing this for years, right? Right, Dave? How long have you been doing
Since
this?
Photoshop 3. And I'm not talking about Creative Suite 3. I'm talking about Photoshop 3 in 1993.
Wow.
And
okay, so
for people that don't know, Photoshop is a product that was developed by Lucasfilm, the people that brought you Star Wars and Pixar. And when you open up Photoshop, you'll see Thomas Knoll. He's one of the guys that is one of the co-inventors of Photoshop. And his brother, John Knoll, is the head of visual effects at Lucasfilm right now that worked on
cool.
the Star Wars movies. So all of these tools actually came out of Hollywood in the film industry. And a lot of the tools on the left side here are the legacy of the old photochemical film world, like dodging and burning is actually terms that were used in negatives, processing negatives when you were exposing them to light. And the marquee tool, which I can go over later, but right now we don't really need to go into that. Marquee tools are used for selecting parts of the image that you want to do things with. But I just don't want to go into everything because we can go crazy.
Yeah, we've also been going for an hour and 15 minutes now. So
oh my God.
Oh my God.
Yeah. See all the fun? And so if you want, what I can do, I can just go over channels briefly and then we could stop. And then I can go over processing this image from A to Z the way I liked it in my final version. I can show that to you next time. But if you guys are okay with time, I just want to talk about channels a bit. Is it okay?
Yeah, absolutely. Go ahead. Yeah, channels are good. And that's something that we can, when we're creating color images out of black and white images,
yes,
then that's something that we need to know for that. So
yes, and what I'll do for that is, like, say from a robotic telescope, I can take some nice color plates or color images and the black and white components and show people how to combine them together with this and how to use certain narrowband images, let's say, and why they are used, where they are used.
I'm going to quickly jump in because I actually, while you were chatting at one point, I sent out a link in the chat, and it has downloads for the robotic telescope data, sample data that we've sent out.
I'll play
so if you want to, we'll do that on a future session.
Sure.
And a question from a couple of folks who've had to leave. This is recorded. It's live on YouTube now, and you'll be able to rewatch it on YouTube for more details as well. Okay, continuing on to channels.
Okay, so I mentioned layers, but another powerful part of Photoshop is the ability to access channels of information, let's say, that make up your image. And like I mentioned earlier, visual images like video images that are used on your video screen, your cell phone, movie theaters, for example, use what's called as the red, green, and blue color space. And the RGB color space is what most naturally reproduces what the human eye can see, although the human eye can see much further than the standard set of red, green, and blue. it is good enough for us to use in our daily lives. There are other color modes that I won't get into, like lab, lightness, channel A, channel B, which can have much more color information than RGB. And CMYK, which is used in the printing world, because as you know, paper is not as bright as light. And that's why cyan, yellow, magenta, and key, or K for black, is used in the printing world. We will not use that for this because we're staying in the video world, or images used on the web, for example. And by the way, any RGB image can be converted without loss into a CMYK, can be converted with a little loss into a CMYK image for printing, but any CMYK image can be converted to RGB, but we're without loss. But we're dealing with RGB. And what do I mean? Well, when you go into your channels panel, and if that's not visible, not to be scared, I'm going to open Windows, Channels, and there it is. And what channels is representation of my image in red, green, and blue. And it always starts off with all of these layers opened up, including RGB here at the top. If I go and I want to see red only, you just click on it. And in here, you're seeing only the red part of the image, what makes up the image in red, in green, and in blue. And you'll notice that my image is brighter in the red. And when you look at the RGB completely, you could see that it did, and I did this on purpose, it has a warmer star background, like it's more in the warmer colors, for example. You see that prominently in the blue because there's less blue information. It's not as bright in the blue. The green is slightly brighter in this area, and the red is very bright. So that when I'm looking at all red, green, and blue put together, this is my image that you get. And why this is powerful, and I won't go into this anymore today, but when we're stacking images that were taken with a monochrome camera, and remember that a monochrome camera uses every pixel to gather information in let's say red, green, blue, ultraviolet, or infrared, or hydrogen alpha, for example, or sulfur, using special filters. These allow that mono camera to be sensitive because every pixel is dedicated, not every fourth pixel, for example, like in a DLSR. So we're using red, green, green, and blue in that pattern I talked to you earlier, the Bayer pattern. So by using a DSLR, I am losing a lot of data or sensitivity compared to, let's say, a monochrome camera used on a robotic telescope, for example, through the telescope. And in those cases, you do have to know about channels and how they work to be able to combine those individually taken images through a red filter, green filter, and blue filter to get the image. All your DLSR camera or mirrorless color camera is doing is taking each chip, pixel on the chip, and it has a little filter, very, very tiny little filter, red, green, and blue, in front of those pixels made by Sony or Canon, the manufacturer. So if you were to take a microscope and zoom in very close, like your computer monitor, for example, you'll see that it's made up of red, green, and blue, red, green, and blue, each pixel. But individually, if you took only red or only green or only blue, you're really only getting a third of the data to show up or to represent your image. By using a monochrome camera, let's say on a robotic telescope, or like many of you guys have that as a more advanced camera, of course, each pixel in that camera is solely dedicated to collecting light information. And in most cases in 16 bits. So you're getting that dynamic range of, let's say, 0 to 1025, and all the steps in between. That gives you a lot of steps to create a lot of detail in your image. So that's simply the channels. And channels are powerful because, as we'll see when I get back to my layers, and I'll just whet your appetite a bit, if one of the curves, adjustment curves that I'm doing, it's now RGB. So I'm affecting everything. But, and by the way, in the RGB, I'll show you this next time, to get rid of this, this point that you do, you just, like an elastic band, you swipe it away. If, let's say, I go only into green, now I'm increasing green only. It's exaggerated, but look what happened to my image. The whole thing is a green cast to it. And this is where you can start to get really powerful results using curves, but per channel. Right now I'm going red, green, or blue, or all of it. And that's represented by these lines here. So I'm going to leave it at that for today. And I'm open to any questions. And that's it.
Perfect. You've been covering a ton in great detail. So there are actually quite a few questions out there.
Okay.
So if you do have questions, toss them in. The one question that we do have that's left that we haven't answered as we've gone is, what PC are you using?
I am using a PC that I built myself because I built my own computers with components. I'm using a 4-core, 2-thread Intel Devil's Canyon chip. It runs at 4 gigahertz per core. So right now I have only 16 gigs of RAM. It used to have 32, but one of the chips burned out. And I'm using memory, Corsair memory, and Windows 10, the latest version. And this is Photoshop Creative Cloud System. So it's literally up to date. As a matter of fact, what's driving me nuts is there's another cloud update today. So I just got a notice. And I dare not did that before this call because that could have caused. So I'm using the latest and greatest, but to do 99.9% of what I showed you guys, you don't need the latest version of Photoshop or the most powerful version of Windows or whatever. You can do this on Linux. You can do this with GIMP. These are very basic processing tools. There's nothing exotic about this to Photoshop, let's say. So, and although my computer, I'm using a video card that a few years ago was equivalent to, it's the titanium from GeForce, the NVIDIA card. The card itself is the size of the computer practically, and it runs on 600 watts of power just for the video card. But you don't need all this to process this stuff. That's just what I want to say. I do a lot of video and 3D animation and rendering, so I need that kind of horsepower. Any other question?
There was a question from earlier, which was, what is the difference between Photoshop and Lightroom? And a couple of people answered it in the comments. So in general, what is your opinion on the difference in terms of why you use Photoshop over Lightroom?
Well, actually, and I'm embarrassed to say this, I don't really use Lightroom too much. I use Adobe Bridge, which when it came out originally about 10 years ago, at first was one of these, what the hell do I need this for? And now I can't live without it. And Bridge and Lightroom, especially Lightroom, is used to pre-process your images before you bring them into Photoshop and play around with them. A lot of what was done with the pre-processing was done by Deep Sky Stacker to begin with. But let's say you took a single shot of the moon, for example. You would go into Lightroom and you can adjust the contrast, you can adjust the exposure, the white balance. You can do all of this, and then undestructively, by the way, to your raw image, select images. It's a way to catalog and have a library of your images. Then you go into Photoshop and you can start playing around with the masks and these adjustment layers. So Lightroom is used for essentially organizing and pre-processing your images. However, I can do that with using Bridge to organize my images. And simply put, when I go into Windows, if I open up, let's say I'll do this quickly. I open up my, not TIFF, but my just all formats. Here's a raw image from my Sony camera. It's automatically going to open up this this dialog box for the raw. And this is what came out of my camera, like just like that. But here I can change the temperature. I can change the exposure. This is the same thing you can do in Lightroom. So Lightroom is essentially a way of pre-processing your images. My workflow is to use Bridge first to select what I care for. And in the case of astrophotography, I go right away into Deep Sky Stacker. I hope that helps.
Okay, perfect. And then one last one, because we are
sure
running quite late, which is, why are you interested in astronomy?
This is where the emotion comes out. I'm a child of the Apollo program. When I grew up, there was a $6 million man on TV. I loved science. I had a science teacher in the 5th grade that brought us to our driveway with a Newtonian reflector. The minute I saw Saturn through that, it just blew me away. I grew up with Star Wars, Star Trek, Star everything, Space 1999. I don't know what it is. I know that my late father was into cowboys and westerns. I grew up in 1968, and I'm proud to say I'm a space nerd. And I don't know. I find comfort and in knowing it's when I go out and do astronomy with my friends, I'm not lost in the night sky. When I see millions of stars everywhere, I'm actually comforted to know that there's so much out there. And the minute I saw this through my telescope, I want to share it with people. I want to show people, wow, look at this. And I can't always do that. I can't bring my friends or my colleagues at work to my telescope. And yes, sometimes I do bring my scope to work. I've done that last year. I've shown things to police officers after hours, and then it always blows people away when you're showing them something that's not on Facebook, not on the internet, but it's something live through your telescope. But like many people, when you go on vacation, you take snapshots and you want memories. And that's where the astrophotos come in. And my love of imaging and processing imaging and photography and video is what leads me to be fascinated with this. And now that we're in the digital world, it's even more powerful than it used to be with film. But I did get started with film. And my friend Paul and and my friend Alex did do that documentary about the eclipse. And so I just love everything to do with astronomy, even solar observing with my hydrogen alpha, just anything. The equipment's just, I don't know what the bug is. I guess it's different for everybody. But ever since I was a kid, totally hooked. I hope that
Amazing.
sort of explains it.
I would say it does. That's fantastic.
Okay. And I love rockets too. Yeah.
Well, thank you so much for sharing all of your knowledge with us today.
Okay.
Huge heads up to the folks. So just to let you guys know who are about to leave, I have set up a survey to go out so that we have an idea of what future sessions you want and how you've been enjoying these so far. It's only 2 pages long, and I say 2 pages, I mean they're like 4 questions each. So please fill that out. Let us know what you're interested in, and I will give all of us who've been working on this, David and Paul and Chris and I, an idea of what you'd like to see in the future.
Thank you.
Thanks everybody for joining, and thank you so much, Dave, for all of your knowledge and your passion and everything that you do.
Thank you.
And we'll see you again soon. Just everybody stay safe.
Play around with it. You can't harm anything. Save your files, save often, save as a PSD file so you don't destroy the original. Never save over the original, and there's nothing that can go wrong. So have fun with it.
That is an excellent message. Everybody enjoy and play, and we will see you next time.
Thank you kindly. Bye.
Bye, guys. Bye,
Stay
everybody.
safe.